The 20 statements test was developed in the 1950s by a social psychologist named Manfred Kuhn. He and his collaborator, Thomas McPartland, were interested in measuring people's self-concepts, and especially the way that their self-concepts relate to the groups that they are in. If you're watching this from my class, you're going to submit your results to me as a participation grade. I'll repeat that. If you're in my class, you're going to submit something to me in a minute as a participation grade. Now, let's play the 20 statements test. Open a document, WordPad, or get a piece of paper. Write "Who am I" on the top. Number the document from 1 to 20. You are going to complete the statement, "I am blank," 20 times. Write down your 20 statements quickly and in no particular order. Don't worry about the logic or the significance of your responses. Write whatever comes to mind. Keep your document open. We'll come back to it in a minute. I'm going to do it too. So far in this class, we've talked about the self, culture, and socialization. We are social and cultural creatures. This lecture dives deeper into a cultural dimension of the self, our social identities. We aren't just a self, rather, ourselves are comprised of many identities. Where do these identities come from? What do they mean? Our identities are socially constructed social facts. This means that they are not set in stone. Our identities come from both within us and outside of us. We can decide to be something, or others can tell us what we are. Either way, our identities have power over us. Identity categories are also part of the symbolic structure, which means that they exist in relation to other social categories and are part of larger webs of meaning. So in this lecture, we're going to look at what identities are. I'm going to try to bridge the micro and the macro here, starting with the 20 statements test, to show you how all of our identities pattern up to create society, the micro shaping the macro, and how the type of society we live in might create certain kinds of people, the macro shaping the micro. I'll talk about two basic ways of looking at identity from the perspective of personal identities and social identities. Then we'll get into the meat of the lecture on social identity theory, which is the idea that people form social groups based on shared identity and then seek to maintain and promote those groups, often against other groups. I'm going to use race as an example of a social identity category and talk a bit about how it has been constructed over time. And finally, I'll leave you with just a thought about intersectionality and the future of racial social identity categories. Okay, back to the 20 statements test. Get out your I am statements. You are going to code your responses after you have answered I am blank 20 times. This means you're going to place each of your I am statements into a category. You already did something like this last week when you conducted a content analysis of search image results in your Google as an agent of socialization assignment, so you may be getting the hang of counting variables and categorizing data. Now, take a few minutes and code your statements, A, B, C, or D. Then count how many statements you have in each category. How many statements fit best in A mode, how many in B mode, and so on. Use your best judgment, and don't worry if something doesn't seem to fit anywhere or if it seems to fit in like 3 categories. Pick what you think makes the most sense. I'll give you some examples from mine, which may help you categorize some of yours. So, let me get mine here. Go through some. I am, number 1, I am a man. That is an A mode characteristic because it is something physical about me. You see it on my driver's license or birth certificate. It's permanent. It's physical. Number 2, I am caffeinated. A or C, depending. It's A because it's physical. Like when I wrote I am caffeinated, I'm really talking about the physical feeling of being caffeinated. I can feel the coffee pulsing in my veins. But it also might be C because being caffeinated is like a mood too. I'm jittery, I'm alert, I'm talking and thinking fast. And being caffeinated is a temporary state. In an hour, I won't be like this anymore, thank goodness. I'm going to say A though because I really meant the physical sensation I get after drinking coffee when I wrote that. So, caffeinated A mode. Okay, next is number 4 on here. I am a son, S-O-N. That would be B mode. because it's a social identity that emphasizes my relationship to others, to my family. I am a teacher is also B mode. Teacher is a socially defined role and a status associated with group membership. It describes my profession, my interaction with you all. It's really central to who I am and how other people know me. All right. I am nice. I am nice. That is C mode. It's a personality trait. So is I am funny. Also C mode. You may disagree, but I am funny. I am a heavy metal fan. That's a personal identity related to personal styles, likes, or interests. That's a C mode too. Though I can see how you say it's B mode if being a fan of something might indicate that I'm a member of a group of other people who are also a fan of that thing. So if you said you're a fan of something and you were really thinking about it in terms of being in a group, then you can put it as B mode. But if you meant it more like a personal interest, go with C mode. And I didn't have any of the D mode stuff this time, but you can see some examples on the slide. If you do this multiple times, you'll have different things that you'll say about yourself, but I have no D mode stuff this time. So if you're in class, there's a link in this week's D2L content module to a form where you will enter how many of each category that you had. Please enter only numbers like the number 2 or 5 or 12. Don't spell them out. I'll run some quick analysis and report back to the class next week. But here's a sneak peek. When researchers first started giving the 20 statements test in the 1950s and 60s, America and Americans were quite different than they are today. Our society and our culture has changed in some significant ways, and Americans aren't quite the same kind of people now as they were in the 1950s. Every semester that I do this, there are more C mode responses than anything, usually followed by A mode. But in the 1950s and 1960s, do you know which mode was dominant? It was B mode. Americans used to be way more willing to adhere to group standards and accept group obligations. Most people were members of their local church. They knew people in their communities and so on. We've become way more individualistic over the decades. Our emotions, our moods, our unique personal traits, styles, likes, and dislikes are far more important are far more important now than they were to people in the 1950s. Social psychologists would say that ourselves have become less institutional, less group-oriented, and more impulsive, more individual. So I propose to you that not only does your self change over time, but so do your identities, your I am statements. They also change depending on context. Try doing this when you're really sleepy or hungry or angry, or at work or at school or with friends or alone, and see what changes. And if all of ourselves and our identities change over time, all of us in a given society, then our society changes over time too. Do we change because society changes, or does society change because we change? It's an interesting question with implications for not only who you are, but for who you can become. You see, different identities are available to us based on our culture, the time, place, and context in which we find ourselves. It's harder for me to be a furrier, not a furry, but a furrier. That's somebody who deals with furs, like cleans fur coats, trades fur animal pelts. Being a furrier is harder today than it was, say, 500 years ago. On the other hand, it is easier if I were to be a furry now because that identity has only been available for the past several decades. It would have been impossible 50 years ago because that was not an available identity. It didn't exist yet in our culture. The identity of furrier, though, used to be available to someone like me. People use animal furs as protective clothing. Animal furs eventually became less of a necessity for warmth or protection than a luxury afforded by the rich. Now the cultural landscape is different, and so is the physical landscape. There aren't wild animals roaming around everywhere. The Industrial Revolution happened so we can make clothes out of other materials. We don't wear fur as much due to ethical concerns, and I've got about 1,000 other options of ways to make a living that would not have been available to me 500 years ago, including being a sociologist. So the culture I live in provides available identities for me to choose from. But my last name is Kirschner. In German, that means furrier. This is likely what my ancestors did. Kirschner is what's called an occupational surname. You've known someone with the last name of baker or farmer or carpenter. Those names were given to their ancestors at some point because that is what their ancestors did. It was the social role they played in their town. Their name was their social identity. There's a phenomenon called nominative determinism, which is the idea that your name influences the type of work that you do. You can see this effect in a lot of professions. It's a small effect, to be fair, but it's interesting nonetheless. For example, there is one first name in particular that is overrepresented among dentists. There's a masculine and a feminine version of this name. Do you know what it is? Dennis or Denise. Yes, there are far more Dennis dentists than we would expect if all the Dennises chose professions at random. And there are more doctors with anatomical last names related to their specialties than random chance would suggest. Here are the results of a study on nominative determinism in hospital medicine by, wait for it, Lim et al., like a limb, right? And the other authors, there's like 4 of them, all of their last names were Lim. So they apparently also have a great sense of humor. But you can see that there is a higher frequency of anatomical names in the specialties related to certain parts of the body. More surgeons' last names are Gore and Butcher than doctors in general. The frequency of pediatric surgeons with the last name Young is 4 times higher than Youngs in general medicine. Urologists are more likely to have last names like Ball, Cox, and Dick, which is hilarious, than doctors in general. We've got more hearts and pumps in cardiology, more heals and pain stills and anesthesia, and so on. Our names are one of the first things that provides us with an identity. Your last name, perhaps, in terms of your family relationships, but probably not in terms of your career anymore, though sometimes, as we see with nominative determinism, it happens, but definitely your first name. Has anyone ever told you that, oh yeah, you seem like an Emma, or you don't act like a Chad, or whatever? Your parents gave you your first name, and they started to think of you based on what that name means to them. It might remind them of the family member or a famous person after whom you are named, and you might develop qualities associated with that person in a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I wonder what your name means. You can look this up if you don't know, using the website on the previous slide. That website is www.behindthename.com. And I wonder if your name gives you an identity. Does it contribute to your sense of self? Do you think you might be any different of a person if you were named something else? My name is David, but my dad wanted to name me Clint after the actor Clint Eastwood. If my name was Clint, I might have been more of a badass. Maybe I learned karate or bull riding or something, but instead, as a kid, I idolized other famous Davids. David Justice, slugger for the Atlanta Braves, was my favorite. He was a left-handed person like me too, and his last name, Justice, how heroic. He was number 23, which I took as my number when I played soccer. Speaking of soccer, David Beckham, famous soccer player, also an idol of mine when I was younger. David Copperfield, fictitious magician, and yes, I went through a magic phase as a child because of him. My name, David, shaped who I was as a kid and who I wanted to become. You can think of how some names rise and fall in popularity. For example, Bella doubled in popularity the year after Twilight came out. Mason experienced a huge surge in popularity after Kourtney Kardashian's son, Mason, was born in 2009. What qualities do you think of when I say the name Karen? Karen has accrued negative meanings via social media, and this has real effects. In 2020, the name Karen, which was already in decline, fell in popularity in the United States to its lowest point since 1927, according to the Social Security Administration. Another interesting trend in the United States is that names are getting more syllables. The only masculine name in the top 100 with 4 or more syllables from 1880 to 1971 was Alexander. Then along came Antonio in 1972, and by 2022 we've also got Santiago, Ezekiel, Leonardo, and Jeremiah in the top 100. The same thing is true for feminine names. Elizabeth was the only 4+ syllable name from 1880 to 1948 in the top 100. Then Victoria and Veronica start appearing, and by 2022, 13 of the top 100 feminine baby names in the United States are 4 or more syllables. So Just by virtue of being born today, you have a higher chance of having a longer name with more syllables than if you were born in the past. Does that make you more likely to have a nickname? Does that matter for identity development? I don't really know, but maybe. So while we may initially think of naming our children or taking on any identity as a very personal decision, it is always influenced by larger cultural values, patterns, and social forces. And as our name tends to become part of our identity, then our identity, because of what our parents named us and how people respond to that name, is also influenced by our culture. Now, I said that well, that's distracting, isn't it? I said that identities are available to us to choose among from our culture. I can choose to be a heavy metal fan or a surgeon or a teacher or whatever. Think of this like an identity buffet down there on the bottom left. There they all are, all laid out, and we pick which ones to put on our plates. But identities are also given to us. We can be buffeted, which means to be hit with identities. The people in the food fight GIF in the bottom right aren't selecting their social identities. Rather, people are throwing identities at them and telling them who they are. But again, people can only hit you with the identities that exist in your culture, although new ones can be created. For example, consider some of those A and B mode statements from the 20 statements test. How many of those did you choose? There are 4 of mine, actually, that I did not choose. I didn't choose to be a man, a son, 5'11", or brown haired. I didn't choose any of those. Those were all given to me by my genes and my culture. And the meanings of those attributes, what it means to be an almost 6 foot tall man, what it means to be a son, how people see me with brown hair instead of bald, are certainly influenced by my culture. It's hard for me to resist how society expects me to think, feel, and act as a man, or what my parents expect of me as a son. Those social identities are largely out of my control. Not totally out of my control, but largely. I mean, I can be a man or a son in my own way, but I may face resistance for deviating from the norm. Consider the options that you do have for resisting or innovating on identities or attributes today in our C mode era, as opposed to the 1950s, the B mode era. If I don't like my brown hair, I can dye it blue if my workplace or family will let me. Feeling oppressed by masculine gender norms, it's more acceptable for men today to get manicures, paint their fingernails, wear makeup, express some femininity. None of that identity play in the 1950s though. And lucky for me, that the main social statuses and social identities I have, my race, gender, sexuality, education, social class, I'm a straight white man, highly educated, and I earn a pretty good living, these are all privileged identities. Our society generally values these identities, but this isn't the case for many people, and we'll talk more about this throughout this course. Now, like I've been saying, the availability of more identities on the buffet these days gives people more options to express themselves and develop unique personal identities than ever before. So I wonder, which of your identity-related I am statements did you choose from the buffet, and which were you buffeted with? Some of your identities are more personal. They're pretty unique in describing you, while others are more social. They place you in groups or categories with others. And some are both, of course. Since we are social and cultural creatures, we have a tendency to form groups based on identity. This phenomenon is called social identity theory. Not only do we tend to form groups based upon identity, but we tend to incorporate group membership into our identity, take steps to enforce group boundaries, maximize positive distinctions that make our group look better than other groups, and we try to maximize the success of people in our groups. We're going to look at the social construction of race and ethnicity to understand social identity theory. That is, the ways in which racial categories and identities have been invented, divided, stereotyped, performed, and ranked. But first, I want to make 5 quick points to keep in mind as you go through the rest of this lecture. Point number 1. People do not understand that social identities are social constructions, that they are invented, subcategorized, stereotyped, performed, and ranked. Point number 2, since people have difficulty understanding point number 1, they think that identities are natural, and they think and act toward others based on stereotypes that are perceived to be true instead of asking sociological questions like, why does this stereotype exist? Who benefits from the existence of this stereotype and who suffers from it? Or How is this stereotype reproduced through social institutions? Point number 3, since people have difficulty understanding point number 2, they fail to understand the outcomes of stereotyping others, like stigma, discrimination, and worse life chances all around for groups of people that receive a lot of negative stereotypes. And they take the outcomes of stereotyping and discrimination also to be natural things. Point number 4, if people think that stereotypes and discrimination against certain social identity groups are natural, then no one is going to change anything. And if you try to change something, you'll encounter resistance. Point number 5, this is also taken for granted that people often have a hard time defining the social identity categories in the first place. I can illustrate that people often have a hard time defining social identity categories in the first place with this image of 2 men. Who are these 2 men? And yes, I know this is made more difficult by the fact that the left-hand picture is in black and white. Do you have any guesses? I'll let you think about it for a second. Okay. The guy on the left is W.E.B. Du Bois. He co-founded the NAACP in 1909. He was the first black person to earn a PhD at Harvard. He wrote extensively on what it was like to be black during Reconstruction. Very important early civil rights advocate. This holds with black folk. Very, very famous. The guy on the right, you probably recognize as Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, proponent of the metaverse, trying to fight Elon Musk. What racial category is he? What racial category is Mark Zuckerberg? If you said white, you're right. So we have a black man and a white man here. But interestingly, one was, and the other would have been, segregated in America based on race. Du Bois because he was black during slavery, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow era, and Zuckerberg because he has a Jewish background. Jews used to be segregated in the United States. They lived in ghettos. In fact, the word ghetto derives from an Italian word that meant an enclosed city in an enclosed area in a city where Jewish people lived. Ghetto originally defined where Jewish people lived. So, is black a racial category? Yes, it is. Is Jewish a racial category? No, it's not. It's an ethnic category based on shared language, culture, and religion. But people used to think of it as a racial one. So, what is a racial category? Well, race is defined as such, a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Now, here's a hard question. And since I'm not in a classroom with you, I'm going to tell you how this conversation always goes. If race is based on real or perceived biological differences, and we know that these 2 men are in different racial groups, then how do you know? How do you know that Mark Zuckerberg is white? Well, you'd probably point first to his skin color, which isn't actually white. How easy it is to poke holes in the arbitrariness of race. If I say, okay, well, what else? You might try and point out hair color and texture or nose shape or something like that. If it was common for people to say that Jews were a race, then he must have some physical characteristics associated with being Jewish too. Does he look Jewish to you? What does it mean to look Jewish? Again, someone might say something about hair or a nose. After all, there are stereotypes about Jewish people's hair and Jewish people's noses. Remember that stereotypes are widely shared ideas about people in a social group. Stereotypes tend to persist regardless of the evidence against them. So, some Jewish people have big noses, as per the stereotype, but certainly not all Jewish people. My dad's side of the family, back to my grandfather, is Jewish. Do I look Jewish? Maybe. How do you know that W.E.B. Du Bois is black? Actually, it's funny because the picture is black and white, and students are often stumped at this question. Students are more likely to guess that this is Joseph Stalin than W.E.B. Du Bois. Without seeing the color of his skin, you have a hard time placing him into a racial category. Students will also say the same things, though, that they said about Zuckerberg, that Du Bois has facial features that look black or something. But then when pressed, students refuse to elaborate on what they mean when they say that someone looks black. The same thing for looks Asian or sounds white or whatever. Students realize that to answer these questions out loud in class, which violates a social norm, especially when you're in a mixed race social group who aren't close friends or family like a classroom. Violating that social norm of don't repeat racial stereotypes makes many people uncomfortable. Most of us don't like doing this because it highlights the fact that we all know what real or perceived features separate people into racial groups, and forcing people to point them out often highlights how arbitrary they are, like Zuckerberg being white because he has light-colored pinkish skin, or people being unable to tell that Du Bois is black from any of his other features. My point here is that we often lack understanding of racial definitions and categories and their histories. We have a blurred understanding of these definitions, the categories, and the means of racial identification, despite the fact they are so central in our culture. I want to stress the perceived differences between groups of people, not just related to race, but also to ethnicity and other social categories. I'll give you 3 quick reasons why presenting race as factually deterministically biological is problematic. 1, there is no way to accurately trace race. Even if you can say that certain phenotypes or physical features are important to defining race and that those phenotypes are genetically transmitted, it is impossible to isolate and neatly categorize them. This is partly because, number 2, there are way too many variations among human beings to place people into the clearly defined biological racial categories that have come to existence over the past several centuries. And 3, because race is not an exact scientific category in the first place, the lines are becoming increasingly blurred through intermarriage, which is increasingly common. For example, in 1967, when Loving v. Virginia was overturned, the one-drop rule in the Supreme Court and legalized interracial marriage, 3% of new marriages were interracial. By 2010, it was 15.1%, and by 2019, 19% of new marriages in the United States were interracial. W.E.B. Du Bois's paternal great-grandfather was a French American, was white, but Du Bois himself was classified as black. Even if one of Du Bois's parents was white and the other one was black, then he would have still been classified as black. This is because of the one-drop rule. Back then, where if you had 1 drop of black blood, then you were black. This was meant to protect the category of white as an elite status in the US. In the US, we typically categorize people into racial groups when they have an attribute, not when they lack an attribute. This is why Obama was the first black president and not the first mixed race president, even though his mom was white and his dad was black. He has the physical attribute of darker skin, and if one has attributes of a lower status group and a higher status group, it is almost always the attribute of the lower status group that gets counted, because that protects the integrity of the higher status group. Even though the one-drop rule was overturned in 1967 by the Supreme Court, modern racial classifications still conform to it. This is why Obama wasn't just another white president or the first mixed race president. He was the first black president. This is why a child with a black parent and a white parent gets called black instead of white. But the rules can change. Mixed or bi or multiracial as racial categories are getting more common, but these terms have only gained traction in the past couple decades, as we'll see later. So because of all this, we can see that race and ethnicity, and you can think nationality and gender and age and disability and all these other social identities, they are socially constructed categories. We understand then that individuals have racial and ethnic identities. These particular identities are ascribed, which means they are assigned to us at birth, and they fundamentally shape our life chances depending on which one we are born into. For example, consider differences in life expectancy in the United States by race. According to the National Institutes of Health in 2019, overall life expectancy was 85.7 years for Asian Americans, the highest, and 73.1 years for Native Americans, the lowest. Simply by virtue of being born into an Asian American family, one can expect to live about 12 years longer than someone who happens to have been born on a Native American reservation. So although these categories are socially constructed, they are real in their consequences. Racial and ethnic categories can be enshrined in law, reproduced via social norms, and can change as populations change or as political expediency necessitates. But we've been talking only about the United States. Racial and ethnic categories are different in different countries. If you're white in Spain, for example, you might come to the United States and be labeled Hispanic. If you're treated one way for being black in the United States, you may be treated differently for being black in Japan, because the meanings that people attach to racial categories vary by culture. However you or I or pop culture define racial groups, though, all governments define racial groups too. And this matters because governments can allocate resources in unequal societies. And governments care how many of each group of people live in their country. So it's really important to ask how governments construct these categories. It is immediately apparent here that they do so differently. If you live in Australia, you can see you might be Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander. But in Bulgaria, no such categories exist. In Australia, they count whether you're Greek, but not in England. In Brazil, you can be white, black, brown, yellow. But of those, the United States only recognizes white and black. What is yellow? And if you're black in the United States and you move to Brazil, are you black or are you brown? Does it depend on the shade of your skin or something else? What would you be in Brazil or England or Bulgaria or South Africa? Here's the 2020 census page for race in the United States. 2020 was actually the first year that you could enter an ethnic or national identity beneath your race. So you may not just identify as black, those real or perceived biological features, but as African American, which encompasses a range of cultural traditions of black people born in the United States that may be different from black people from other ethnic backgrounds, like those born in Ethiopia. What does it mean that people can self-identify ethnic categories? Well, for one, it means that people have never been able to self-identify ethnic categories on the census before, which means that we always had inaccurate data for how many black Americans identified as of Ethiopian descent, for example, or for how many white Americans identified as of Irish heritage. Now, such things can be counted. There have been a lot of major changes to the US Census over time, and each change to the census and how the government defines racial and ethnic categories literally changes the demographic composition of our country. To follow the link on this slide, open a browser and Google what the census calls us. You should see a Pew research tool, that's Pew, P-E-W, Pew research tool that shows the history of census categories all the way back to the first US Census in 1790. Pause the video here and play around with that site, it's super cool. Click through the different years and see how categories were added, removed, and renamed. What is most interesting to me is how categories changed based on larger social changes in the country. I'll point out a few of my favorites, and you can see some others listed on this timeline here. But if you click from 1840 to 1850, you'll see that the categories of free colored males and females and slaves have changed to some other categories. Now it says black, mulatto, black slaves, and mulatto slaves. Slavery was still legal in 1850, but change was coming. Note that the sexual abuse of black women and men too was not uncommon by slave masters. Therefore, over the years, there was an ever-increasing number of mixed-race children born from a white father and a black mother. This proved problematic for the dominant white majority, not least of which because it was evidence of their sexual exploitation, collective infidelities, and moral hypocrisy. A new category was created for the offspring of these people, mulattoes. Why create a new category? Well, because America had to clarify that these children were not white. If they were white, they would have received all the benefits of being white. So a new subcategory of black was created that kept them subjugated. You see the same thing happen in 1890 when black was further subdivided into quadroon, 1/4 black blood or one grandparent, and octoroon, which is 1/8 or less of black blood or one great grandparent. So now the descendants of the earlier generation's mulattoes were further subdivided and classified as well. Even if they were 7/8 white, they were still counted as black because they had one great grandparent who was black or who had black blood. The bar for being white changed from being 1/2 white, having one parent who was white, to more than 7/8 white ancestry required. This is a really good example of what's called the minimal group paradigm, which says that people distinguish their in-groups from other groups for the most trivial of reasons, like whether one of your great-grandparents was black or not. You might think that the one-drop rule emerged in this time. After all, having 1/8 black ancestry might seem like just a drop, but if you keep clicking on the census years, you'll see some subdivisions of black remain until 1930, when the federal government instituted the rule that if you have any black ancestry, then you are black. America literally became black and white when it came to black people and white people in 1930. It hadn't been like that since the 1840s. They turned the clock back 100 years. Again, why? To maintain the elite status, the positive distinction of the white race in a white supremacist society when it was facing threats, right? When it was facing threats, that's key. In 1960, the census was completely conducted by mail for the first time, and people could self-identify, not as multiple races or an ethnicity beneath a racial category like in 2020, but they could self-identify as whatever the boxes, the categories were that were available. Before 1960, there was limited self-identification. The census taker, also called an enumerator, as you can see here, the man with the large book, the survey. He came to your house with the census survey, and you didn't get to tell him what you were. Or if you did, and he doubted you based upon what he was trained to look for, those real or perceived biological differences that determine racial categories, then he wrote what he thought. What happened to racial demographics as a result of self-identification in 1960? Well, once they could self-identify, 80% of Puerto Ricans chose white, whereas only 40% had been identified as white in face-to-face censuses. The federal government had categorized Puerto Ricans as predominantly black, but the Puerto Rican population defined their racial identity differently. The Native American population nearly tripled from 1960 to 1980 and more than doubled again from 1980 to 2000. People who had identified as American Indian had been somewhat invisible to the government before then. They were usually classified as white or Hispanic. So switching from enumerators, these people, the census men, to mail surveys had the effect of shifting, to some extent, race as a matter of physical appearance to a matter of personal or social identity. And this continues as race becomes more personal and as the boundaries between previously rigid racial categories crack further. In 2000, Americans could, for the first time, select more than one racial or ethnic identity. 150 years after the category of mulatto was created to capture people who were half black and half something else, people who were bi or multiracial finally got to self-identify as such. 6.8 million Americans did that in 2000. About 10 million people did it in 2010, and in 2020, that number was 33.8 million Americans, or over 10% of the population that identified as multiracial in 2020. That rapidly increasing number of Native Americans we tracked a minute ago, it more than doubled again between 2000 and 2020 as more and more Americans identify as partially Native American. This isn't occurring through rising fertility rates or immigration, but largely through white Americans shifting their racial identities to become Native American. The changing categories in the census and the differences among categories between nations show us that racial and ethnic categories are political categories as much as anything else. They are chosen by government officials who are responding not to biological realities, but to immigration, war, prejudice, and social movements. Yet people also claim racial and ethnic identities as their own. We perform race and ethnicity through our dress, our speech, our friends, our music, and so on. On St. Patrick's Day, for example, you can observe millions of white Americans performing what's called symbolic ethnicity, that is, asserting their Irish heritage through dress, music, parades, and drinking green beer on this special festive occasion. You may know someone whose racial identity allows them to move between different racial groups. A Hispanic white American who switches between groups of Spanish-speaking family members and English-speaking peers, perhaps never being Mexican enough or being told that they're too Americanized to fit in comfortably when visiting home, but being too ethnic when they're around their friends. So here's a key point. Race is arbitrary. It is socially constructed, yet it is still experienced as real and has real consequences. All social identities are like this. We exist at the intersection of their power over us, the power of society to create categories for us, to divide us into categories, to attach meaning to those categories, and to arrange those categories into a hierarchy. We exist at the intersection of their power over us and our power to perform, to innovate, to self-identify, and to create meaning for categories, both individually and collectively. You can see evidence of this latter point on the images here. Human beings can represent skin color through a plethora of visual media that defy traditional classifications of race. The t-shirts with historical census categories here point out that one person falls in different categories over time. Race is not stable. The Humane Project in the upper right demonstrates the diversity of human skin tones. Presented in a grid like this, how many colors do you see? Do these colors lend themselves to categorization of any kind? Do the colors align themselves neatly with US racial categories? This project undermines the American habit of thinking that our racial categories actually reflect color or color accurately. The National Geographic story called The Changing Face of America in the bottom right suggests that increasing numbers of interracial marriages are producing more and more multiracial children who will themselves marry and reproduce, further weakening the boundaries between current racial categories. What if we can't assign people a racial category by looking at them? If we can't slot people into familiar categories, perhaps we'll be forced to reconsider existing definitions of race and identity, presumptions about who is us and who is them. Perhaps we'll all end up less parsimonious about who we feel connected to. I will suggest to you that it's more important now than ever to think of ourselves intersectionally, not least because we are, as a society, becoming more diverse, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of all social identity categories. Intersectionality means that we exist at the intersection, at the crossroads of many social identities. Social identities interact to shape the lives of individuals and groups. I mentioned earlier that I am a straight white man. Going around the circle here, I'm also highly educated with a PhD, I'm able-bodied, no disabilities. I'm in the middle of my life expectancy, I'm American, I speak English fluently. Here, each of these social identities intersects to shape various aspects of my life, from my job prospects, to my chances at love, to my ability to travel abroad, to my insurance premiums, to my ability to schmooze with other people in the status elite and expand a social circle that can provide innumerable connections and other benefits. As I have said, I am in a privileged position in the status elite because I carry a variety of positively regarded social identities, but not everyone is. And if we are to understand society, the experiences of other people, the relationship between selves and the larger social world, then we cannot only look at people as a racial group, or a sexual orientation, or a social class. Rather, we have to look at individuals and groups at the intersections of their identities and understand how their lives are shaped not by social identities in isolation, but by social identities collectively. So, today we have examined identity, both how identities are personal, unique to us and ourselves based on our tastes, likes, and dislikes, and how identities are social, placed upon us by others, and connecting us in groups of similar people. Remember the difference between identity buffets and identities that buffet us. We've covered social identity theory, which says that people form social groups based on shared identity and then seek to maintain and promote those groups, often against other groups. We looked at race as an example of a social identity category and talked about how it has been constructed over time, especially through censuses. Finally, we considered the future of race in America and ended with the urgency of incorporating intersectionality into our developing sociological imaginations. You can't really understand the relationship between self and society unless you consider the intersections of social identities that shape the lives of individuals and groups. This is the end of the lecture. I will flip through a few remaining slides with suggested resources. Thanks for listening.